Okay. Good evening, everyone. We've got a special treat for you tonight. Two theologians for the price of one. I'm joined by my lovely friend Anna from my parish, and I don't think it's very often that you'll find two Catholics who are both students of theology in one parish and passionate about their faith. So we're very fortunate to be very good friends. We've got an interesting piece of news to talk to you about tonight. We're going to talk about an interview in the Catholic World Report with this Polish Archbishop Stanisław Gądecki. So, which we both sent to each other today, haven't we, Anna? And it was very interesting.
I'm glad you attempted the pronunciation of his name and I didn't have to.
I did think that we should...
that in Essex language.
So this guy, who is the head of the Polish Episcopal Conference, was at the Synod of Synodality, and he's put this in Catholic World Report, which is a really good outlet if you're not familiar with it, to know what's going on in the church. He was made a bishop by John Paul II in 2014, and he's the president of the Polish Episcopal Conference. And I think this is his second term. He was elected in 2019 for his second term. So there's a lot going on in Poland at the moment, Anna, isn't there? There's a lot of people saying that they're sort of collapsing a little bit in terms of the faith.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think culturally it still seems to be very Catholic in terms of, the Catholicism is intertwined with the kind of the Polish identity, I suppose. And I think you probably find that in a lot of European countries sort of 20, 30 years ago. And gradually we're sort of seeing this dwindling where, Catholics, particularly in terms of the practice of the faith, they're not seeing that so much intertwined with their identity anymore. They become sort of nominally Catholic. And so, you gradually see them sort of, they're attending mass less regularly, but they're still there at all the important sort of feasts and festivals, and perhaps carrying on those kind of cultural traditions of, particular meals that you would have as a family on holy days of obligation, or, marking those feasts of the church. I think just lacking that kind of, knowledge of why they're doing why they've always done what they've done. And yet it's interesting that, the Polish families that I know here, the faith is still very central. So I don't know whether there's, if they're living in another country, that they're wanting to hold on to that Polish identity, and being part of the church goes along with that, perhaps. I also read something today that actually kind of countered what you were saying, Mark, where they were saying actually, within the Western world that Poland are doing all right. So yeah, it's interesting depending on who you talk to. And obviously they've got that legacy of the great Pope St. John Paul II. So it's interesting to see where they're at the moment, and then compare that in terms of other Catholic countries in Europe. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy would be those Mediterranean countries as well, the ones that immediately spring to mind. But it certainly seems like they've got some hope with this Archbishop. You get that sense that he's come through Poland at a time where, so many Poles must have been so inspired by Pope John Paul II. And this is part of his legacy, good, solid Catholic archbishops like Archbishop Gądecki.
Yeah, I think that there's so many priests out there. I know that I've got several priests that I've been speaking to over here who've been talking about a strategy where we assist with seminarian places in order, like, to swap out some priests to help out in the diocese. So I don't know. That seems like a really sound idea. Like, they had more vocations than they knew what to do with.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the Polish priests that I know here are really, really solid, well-formed, believing Catholics, and hardworking as well, like incredibly hardworking within their communities. So it's, you know, it's interesting that they are.
They're young guys as well. They're young guys as well,
Yeah,
aren't they?
absolutely. I mean, I think of a particular priest who's here, and in the family there are two of them, two sons, and both of them brothers have become priests. So one's got parish in, I think he's in Warsaw, and then the other one is here. Both through an order. They saw the La Salette order within their local parish community growing up as boys, and, you know, found them so inspirational. It inspired their vocation. So yeah, really, really good stuff in terms of what we encounter from the Polish communities here in the UK.
Very positive. I've got a friend, Mike Carroll, who has written an excellent book actually on the threefold path to holiness. He's been out in Poland for quite a long while, sort of speaking to different professors and getting their take on how this all integrates with Vatican II and everything. And certainly whenever I speak to him, he's extremely positive about the Catholicity in Poland. So, you know, it's difficult to know how to read it, but as you say, this is a great encouragement. This, you know, the input here from Archbishop Gądecki. So perhaps we just have a little read through, and you can, if there's anything that particularly you think is important, then, you know, just shout out. So this is an interview with Catholic World Report, and it starts off. Catholic World Report asks, "Excellency, this is the 5th synod in which you've participated. What surprised you during the synodal assembly in Rome this past month?" And he says the consultation process launched by Pope Francis at parish, diocesan and national, and finally continental levels, was new and interesting experience. Everyone was invited to participate regardless of their attitude to the faith and the Catholic Church. As a result of this approach, sometimes the non-Catholic voice was more audible than the Catholic one. However, this is not what seeking God's will is all about. We saw a wide variety of viewpoints, with the most extreme ones articulated in Germany, where the synodal Weg ran parallel with the synodal process. So I know you were really involved, weren't you, in the consultation stage in our diocese. Would you agree with what the Archbishop says there? Was there a lot of whinging going on at the diocesan level?
I mean, I think you only have to kind of look at things like Google reviews to kind of gauge that people generally want to give their opinion if they've got a strong opinion. And so whether you're ever going to get kind of the average person's perspective, if you're asking a whole group of people, you know, to respond, and they're not obligated to feed back to you, you know, invariably the feedback that you're going to get is going to be, you know, positive or negative at one end of the spectrum or the other. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably fairly reflective of what we encountered in our diocese as well. Either that, or it's just the same voices that you always hear. It's the same people that are kind of interested and involved. I think, you know, the problem that we found was that the majority of people didn't either understand the process, and partly that was, I think, to do with there was a very short amount of time in which we had to kind of get ourselves together and start gathering this, or start carrying out these listening exercises and putting together a synthesis really of what you know, what those comments and that feedback from the and I was going to say from the laity, but I mean, really, we were encouraged to kind of go out to not just the Catholic community, but to speak to everybody about their perspectives on life within the church. But obviously more voices came from within the church than outside of the church. Some people were really good at kind of reaching out to other Christian communities, or other people in their local community, or people who perhaps become disaffiliated, so baptized Catholics who are no longer practicing, you know, just trying to hear everybody's voice, really, you know. And so, yes, I think those strong opinions did emerge. I just think it's really interesting, even in that first paragraph, that, you know, he kind of lays his cards on the table immediately, in that he's, you know, he's trying to put forward his definition of what it is to be Catholic. And you can kind of gauge from this that, you know, the experience when you speak to everybody within the church is actually that not everybody is on the same page. And so some people would say that to be Catholic is, you know, to be believing and subscribing to kind of all Catholic doctrine, or being in submission to what the church teaches. And then you'd perhaps have others who at the other end of the spectrum would say that it's more about the relationship with Jesus and less about you know, what the church, how the church kind of teaches us. Yeah, so it just, I don't know, just really interesting that he sort of almost puts that into the non-Catholic box, rather than yeah, and then it sets a precedent for how the document goes forward, how the interview goes forward, really. I just think it's a very interesting take, and it's kind of saying what a lot of us are thinking out loud,
Yeah.
which is really good, because if an archbishop is thinking it, then it certainly makes the faithful who have concerns about the direction of the synod, you know, perhaps feel a little bit more at ease about their own unease.
Yeah, well, and that's what I kind of, you know, really felt like it was geared up so that the non-Catholic voice was more audible than the Catholic one. And I suppose a lot of my my concerns about the process was the lack of formation, and that was something that came out, wasn't it, in a lot of the consultation document. Was a lot of Catholics were saying that they didn't really understand what the church taught on, you know, any given issue.
And I do think it's important, like, you have to ask, if you're not here, why aren't you here? Like, we need to get to the bottom of that. Like, we have a message which, you know, we believe so wholeheartedly in, and we believe is so good, and we want to share it with others. And if people aren't open to that, or people have experienced problems with that, you have to listen to them. You have to get to the bottom of what's actually gone on, because there's obviously, you know, as we'll see sort of as we go further through the interview, you sense that there's a lot of hurt in people and a lot of pain. And, you know, it's trying to decide whether that's more about what the church teaches or whether that's more about the individual's experience, I suppose.
Subjective experience.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we could go deeper into that. Let's crack on with
Let's
the
keep
thing.
going.
So the diversity of opinions and balancing on the verge of orthodoxy was also heard in Rome, which was partly reflected in the final document. In addition, the confidentiality clause for everyone regarding what happened in the Synod Hall was new. In fact, with the exception of James Martin, who broke this rule at a meeting with the European Union ambassadors, everyone followed it. So that's quite interesting. He's immediately going for Father James Martin, isn't he?
Did you get to the bottom of what James Martin had actually said to those European? I couldn't find a transcript of his speech with them, or whether that was behind closed doors, or.
I'm sure I can, and I'll see if I can find it. If I can find it, I'll certainly post a link to it or whatever. But I did find that he's got this on his Twitter feed here. Thanks to all the ambassadors from the European Union countries to the Holy See for inviting me to talk about LGBTQ Catholics today. Sorry I couldn't stay longer, but the Synod calls. It certainly did. So that was on the 19th of October. So he certainly was. So it's definitely a thing.
The Archbishop is suggesting that he did break the confidentiality clause when he went to the European Union. So someone must have an idea of what it was that he said to them, or
exactly, the story must be out there somewhere, and I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it. Okay, so the next bit then is the Synod offered a lot of time for prayer and meditation. We spent a considerable amount of time in small groups where, however, there was no opportunity for authentic conversation. The requirement was to listen without prejudice to the interlocutor and not enter into polemics. It's an interesting experience, but it does not serve dialogue. That is, a rational search for the truth, even though in my group, everyone was very friendly. In addition, specific issues were assigned to each table in advance, so being assigned to a particular group was equivalent to being excluded from the conversation on other topics. There were also plenary sessions where one could make their voice heard. 3 and then 2 minutes were allotted for statements. Some participants managed to talk 3 or 4 times. I, oddly enough, was not so lucky. We were encouraged to send positions to the Secretariat, but no one seems to have read them so far. So again, it's very clear that he's not overly enamored with the process, but it also sort of speaks to the fact that the process seems to have been geared. There's a lot of commentators who have spoken to the fact that the whole synod on synodality was a bit of a bottleneck, where you had a very small proportion of the church who were telling the rest of the church what they should be doing. And much of the hot button stuff came out in the social media beforehand, on the Synod VA Twitter feed, for example, and in lots of the, there were I don't know how much of it you've digested yourself, Anna, but a lot of it, we kind of feel like is a semiotic experiment where the Pope might be saying very little, or he might be saying things that sound sort of Catholic, but all the signalling was very much in the other direction, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, you can really gauge what the Archbishop thinks about the whole process just from really this first part of the interview, and so to my understanding, what happened when they went to Rome was that there were delegates that were chosen by each particular country or bishop's conference, but then there were also particular delegates that were chosen specifically by Pope Francis. And I don't know whether it was ever stated that the people that were chosen by the Pope were supposed to be kind of experts within a particular field, and that's why they were there to be involved in specific conversations. I mean, it never seemed to be that explicit that was why they were there, but certainly, it would seem like, James Martin, for example, would have been called in to speak because he's very passionate about working with, people who identify as LGBTQ+. You can't imagine that he wouldn't be on a table that was involved in some conversations around that subject matter, but we don't really know those details, do we? Likewise, you would think that people dealing with the role of women in the church, there would be particular people where that's been part of an apostolate that they've or something that they've studied or worked towards. But again, they weren't really advertised as experts. It was as if they were all going on equal footing. It's a bit strange, really, the way that they didn't kind of make that clear, even though it seems to be self-evident.
Yeah, and James Martin wrote a review himself in America magazine, and one of the things he says in that is that, there was archbishops talking to 19-year-old teenagers from Michigan, and you just wonder, like, what if you're, I kind of think if you're not formed, it's difficult enough to keep up with these conversations, especially if they get quite theologically dense. You wonder what exactly is being contributed by some of these people. I mean, with James Martin, as you say, he's only got one issue. There's only one thing that he ever talks about, and that seems, from anyone who studied theology, wouldn't you agree, to be a false anthropology? That's the problem with it, and the church hasn't even accepted that anthropological or faux anthropological term before the papacy of Pope Francis. In fact, explicitly, it's rejected it in Vatican documents because it's a misrepresentation of what it means to be a human being. To you know, we're made in the image and likeness of God. Not we don't identify ourselves with a sexual orientation, do we?
I suppose if you were trying to be really charitable, you could say, you know, of all people, he has had a lot of experience dialoguing with people who identify in that, you know, who self-identify in that way, even if that's not how the church has traditionally identified them. So I suppose maybe you could argue that he's useful just from the perspective that he's having those conversations with people who are hurting, you know. And I do think behind all of this, the good that I can see in it is that there are people who are struggling in all different senses. You know, that was, I think, the thing that came out of a lot of the synthesis documents was, you know, how do we better reach these people that are hurting and struggling, and what do we do with them? You know, how do we best love them? And I suppose the issue is that there seem to be two very different camps, you know, emerging as to how you love people in this way, you know. And he, again, I don't want to get too far ahead, but he kind of goes on to talk about that a little bit further. It's really interesting, his take on it and the way that he observes that issue.
Well, and it's good to see it in the context of Archbishop John Wilson's letter that I read out and did a video on yesterday, which is very clear and very clearly, you know, takes the Catholic line. So I don't know, myself, I felt really comfortable with the beautiful way that he explained those things. Okay, so moving on. The next question from Catholic World Report is, did the participation of the laity in the Synod on Synodality give a different style to the work? And the Archbishop says, the participation of the lay faithful in the consultation process was natural. It is common practice in local churches. So there he's saying, you know, there's nothing unusual about us having a consultation. Like, you would have thought that in the part of sharing the faith is sharing information. So you have a conversation, don't you? It's that's the method of evangelization, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fundamentally. So, yeah. In the case of the assembly in Rome, however, there was a question about the nature of the assembly. The Pope convened a synod of bishops when the word bishops was removed from the name and only the term synod remained. Then came the realization that such a reality does not exist either in canon law or the tradition of the church. Therefore, bishops were reinstated in the name of the event. In the discussion, however, there is a distinction between a synod of bishops and ecclesial assembly. The will of Pope Francis, as expressed in his Apostolic Constitution Episcopalis Communio, expanded the group of those participating in the synod to include those who do not share in episcopal authority, but nevertheless hold the right to speak and vote. Pope Francis, therefore, named the Synod of Bishops as an institution that differs from that known from the tradition of the Church, and that described in the Code of Canon Law, which was emphasized primarily by the bishops from the Eastern churches.
So he's saying that it's the bishops of the Eastern churches that were really the ones to highlight the fact that this is not in keeping with what the church has always done, or how the church has always seen a synodal process, I suppose. Is that correct?
Yeah, and they actually came out, didn't they, and said this is not what we recognise as synodality, which was really interesting. And because Pope Francis and the Curia were sort of trying to play it off that, oh, this is the way that church is done in the East anyway. I mean, he paints a picture here, Gądecki, of a right mess, doesn't he? Which seems to be a lot of what goes on in the Vatican these days. It's not very clear. Okay, so the next bit then is the next question. The Synod on Synodality began in 2021 with a diocesan phase. What did the process of synodal consultations look like in Poland? How much interest was there in it among the laity? So this is the big question, isn't it? And
well, this part's really good because this really gives you a flavour. I know we sort of gave our own impressions of what's going on in Poland, but this really gives you a good flavour of the way things are in Poland at the moment, certainly in amongst those who responded, who participated within the process, you know, at the Bishops' Conference level.
So he says less than 1% of Catholics probably participated in the entire consultation process. At the same time, as usual with such initiatives, also in the secular environment, these were active people in acts and in words. Hence, the question about representativeness of the opinions collected. Nevertheless, the fact that we could get to know them should be considered positive. So he's not just being completely negative. He's trying to take the positives out of his experience, isn't he? They were not voices that we had not heard before, but now we have allowed them to be heard as if from within the Catholic Church. The situation was similar in Poland. The Polish consultations also showed that improving relations between clergy and laity is one of the most urgent tasks. The month we spent together at the Vatican was an opportunity to work on it a little for the bishop. It is also an opportunity to be nourished by the faith and example of people who have families and, at the same time, without neglecting their duties, find time to spend long moments in the chapel, sometimes longer than the average clergyman. However, the group of non-bishops involved was very diverse, and the manner in which they were nominated made it questionable whether their views were representative of a given church, diocese, or parish. The growing sense of co-responsibility on the part of the laity for the church and evangelization is to be greeted with enthusiasm. It's not wholly new, because we would not have figures like St. Catherine of Siena, St. Thomas More, or Blessed Carlo Acutis without this sense of responsibility. However, the question arises whether there is a specific vocation of the laity and a secular path to holiness, or whether the only model is the priestly path and the laity can fulfill mission resulting from holy baptism to the extent that they become like priests. In the conversation about the laity, I see the need to defend the secularity of the laity against attempts to clericalize them. If the laity were to focus only on liturgical matters in their thinking about vocation, many areas proper to their vocation, such as the family or politics, would be neglected. So what's this about, Anna?
It's really good. Well, the thing that sort of jumped out at me was this idea, Polish consultations also showed that improving relations between clergy and laity is one of the most urgent tasks. And I sort of immediately thought of all the abuse scandals that have come out over the last few years, and this kind of culture of mistrust. And so it is important. And it's important as well that our clergy are, embedded within the life of the community, that they're not kind of hidden away in their presbyteries and seeing the parishioners for sort of 5 minutes at the end of Mass on a Sunday, or just, just having them in when there's a problem or something needs doing, but actually, knowing their sheep, knowing what's going on in their lives, being interested in them. And they've all come from families. And I think, then to kind of not have that life where you're around families all the time, you can end up being kind of out of touch with that reality. So I see what he's saying. It's a good thing, really, that it's not just this group of bishops, as we've traditionally seen, getting together, in Rome to speak about the church, but actually that the laity are involved. It's important that the laity have their part. Now, whether you can call it a synod of bishops or not is a different argument, but I agree that it is important that the clergy and the laity have this opportunity to not just to dialogue, but to spend time together, to get to know each other, because that's how, in my mind, that's how the clergy can best support their people, if they really know them and they know where they are and they know what's going on in their lives. So I agree with what he's saying. I think it's really interesting as well that he kind of highlights this idea that almost like the people that were selected, where they're not really truly representative of a parish community, that it's almost like the tick box exercises that you see, for example, in television programs now. When you're hiring actors for TV programs, you have to tick particular boxes and fill particular quotas, even if sometimes that ends up meaning that the production looks really forced, like it's there to convey a different message rather than just be a piece of entertainment. And I think, you know, we have to be really careful in the church that we're not just doing things for the sake of being politically correct or appearing to, you know, be trying to make things fair, but they end up not having the right balance. I think that's what he's getting at anyway. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think he's reinforcing the hierarchical structure of in ecclesial terms as well, don't you? He's saying very much at the same time he's saying let's not blur, and it's interesting that it's to do with clericalization, which is one of the things that Pope Francis constantly reminds us of, and I think it is a valuable thing that the Pope says, although there's a conflict there with this idea of that. It seems that the only power available to some people, and really what we're talking about here is female ordination, isn't it? Is this that the only value the laity have got in the church is if they can, confect the Eucharist, which is just so myopic. It totally misses the point, really, and the powerful way that the church portrays women. And the value and the dignity, the special dignity that it gives to women. So, like if you just reduce it down to who can be a priest, and that's the most important thing, from an ecclesial point of view, and John Wilson does this beautifully, the Archbishop of Southwark. It's the priesthood is about service. It's about laying your life down for your parish family, for the people that you serve. And the same for the Pope. The Pope is supposed to be the servant of the servants of God. And so when you sort of see it in purely power terms, your ecclesiology is all completely wrong, and you've really got the wrong idea, haven't you? So
yeah,
and I think he's saying that quite clearly, isn't he, Gądecki there?
Oh, definitely. You know, towards the end of that, the last couple of paragraphs, you know, you can see him. I mean, he makes the point that when the laity take responsibility for evangelization, that's where saints are made. Yeah. You know, and he gives those really good examples of Catherine of Siena and St. Thomas More and Blessed Carlo Acutis. You know, and I really think that's emphasizing that we actually each have our own path to holiness. You know, there is not just kind of one path which involves, you know, being the priest, being the person confecting the sacraments. That's, you know, and also it's this idea that it's sort of imposing this idea of the world on the church again, isn't it? Where, you know, it blurs the lines between the roles of male and female, and, you know, that there's no difference, and that actually, you know, the church has had this fantastic, beautiful tradition of really emphasizing, you know, the nature of masculinity and femininity in the past, and how those two roles are complementary, and that the church needs both of them, and that if you kind of merge them and blend them together, it just, I don't know, it just, to me, it's just not how we have always understood, you know, anthropology in the church. So it's really, yeah, really good, this idea of we all have that individual path to holiness, you know, and actually our life's mission is to work out what that is. You know, how is God wanting to use us to make us holy? That's not going to be the same for everybody. And so to suggest that, you know, by making women priests, everything becomes equal, you know, we just know that doesn't work.
Yeah, and a completely false understanding of what equality is, where we understand, you know, that we have equal dignity, but different skills and abilities and talents, and we all sort of work to those. I think it's really interesting as well that Pope Francis has consistently spoken about the synodality project as being something that's the fulfillment of Vatican II. But here you see Archbishop Gądecki giving a really good outline of the anthropology of Lumen Gentium, or the, you know, in Lumen Gentium, where it speaks about the vocation of the laity. And that vocation is to go out into the world as salt and light, and to change it with the gospel. And that's really what he's saying here. That's a beautiful thing. And that's the correct hierarchy, isn't it? When you've got, because the priest's role is to bury the dead, to confect the sacrament, to hear confessions, to visit the sick. and we're the ones, we have to go out, raise our families, etc. And they're different vocations. So if you make everything all the same, you lose the the charism of those particular callings in life, don't you? Those particular vocations.
And I always think as well, surely better to do one thing well than to try and do everything, and then you're not going to do things as well. So just the idea that I'm just looking back on here, if the laity were only to focus on liturgical matters in their thinking about vocation, many areas proper to their vocation, such as the family or politics, would be neglected. The family is the instrumental means by which the faith is passed on. We cannot afford, we're not in a position where we can neglect that now, in order to kind of satisfy people's desire for this false equality. So,
well, and it's totally missing from this whole synodal process, isn't it? I mean, if you wanted to talk about what are the on fire issues for the church in this particular moment, surely the destruction of the family has got to be right up there at front and center. And instead you see this, I mean, it's quite subtly done, but you can see that Archbishop Gądecki is pointing out the fact that there's this creeping secularism just in the way that we understand anthropology through the synodal process. And he's pushing back against it beautifully, isn't he, here?
Okay. Should we move on?
Yeah, the next bit. What do the participants expect from the synod, and what are your expectations? This assembly was unique. The process started as early as 2021. The event is planned to take 3 years. In this regard, some may associate it with the council. More important, however, is its social and cultural context. Catholicism is in severe crisis in Western Europe, where the church is most modernized. In a sense, this is the local phenomenon. However, the universality of this synod means that we can, and sometimes must, confront Catholics from other parts of the world who are often surprised by our problems. In my view, the presence of the Eastern churches and, somewhat more broadly, the martyr churches, i.e. from regions where persecution of Christians is ongoing or has recently ended, is very important here. We have the problems of the satiated churches, the main issues raised by Western churches, including the German synodal weg, are those of a consumer civilization in which people have become accustomed to not having to deny themselves at anything. Churches from developing countries often lack material resources, but do not lack faith and witness to life. Thus, we have a meeting of churches of excess and churches of scarcity. Of course, the latter also have their problems. The threat of squandering the achievements of 2 millennia of Christianity is staring us, representatives of the West, in the face. Just as Europe once shared its faith, today it may begin to share its lack of faith, which is destroying churches in other parts of the world. Hence the question, will the synod in its entirety be a place for the transmission of the faith, or rather unbelief? Wow, that's quite a big question, isn't it? I think that Christians in the West often doubt that they have something so essential to communicate to people that their fate, i.e. salvation or damnation, depends on its acceptance or rejection. So to avoid being rejected, they try to hide that part of Jesus' teaching, which might meet with opposition and expose only that which is shared with the world. Wow, that's a brilliant bit, isn't it?
I think those paragraphs there are, I think, some of the best things that he said. And, really, so this idea that we are so Western centric that we almost struggle to understand what it's like to be a Christian in a country where you're openly persecuted, every day for your faith. You're worried every time you go to church that, something awful might happen. Like, we've just got no grasp of that at all in this country, in the West. We're so used to practicing our faith in a kind of a comfortable situation. And so when you put a group, it reflects the universality of the church, doesn't it? When they all gather together, that you're hearing from people who are experiencing things that are just so far beyond your everyday, life experience. And it just strikes me that these are the people who've got real problems. Almost we've become as a society so comfortable that we're almost inventing problems. We're almost kind of coming up with these ideas that just would never occur to someone in Africa. Or it made me think immediately of Matt Walsh's What is a Woman, where he goes out to Africa, and it just, it's the first thing that I thought of, where it just, their life is so much more challenging that they just don't even think about these things, and they're so much more dependent on God as a result. I think it just shows that in the West we've become so comfortable that we just, God becomes an optional thing rather than our life depends on this, and that's not, that's not the gospel. That we're called to preach the urgency of the need to repentance and the need to turn to Christ, and clearly they're doing that better. Well, it seems to me that they're doing that better in countries where the situation is more desperate, and I think we've got a lot to learn from them. And I remember a priest once saying to me, it'd be, the African priests that end up coming as missionaries to Europe and re-evangelizing the West, and that's, I have to hope and pray really that becomes their mission, because I think we need it.
Definitely. I suppose there's always a danger as well of thinking of Africa as sort of missionary territories, when you remember like Tertullian, in the, what was that, the 4th century, the zealous African. So, we've still got a lot of learning that comes out of Africa, and Africa was a Christian country right from the beginning in lots of areas. So I think that's an important part. But yeah, it's the urgency. And it's funny because a lot of the conversations that I've been having the last little while coming out of the Synod have revolved around that idea that one of the biggest challenges facing us in the West is that of apathy. And I know you're a mum and a teacher, and you're that's what you're. Would you say that's the biggest challenge facing you with young people that you encounter? And
I think it's really interesting because I think there is such a contrast in areas of deprivation versus areas of wealth. And if I think about the area that we live in, there is such apathy, amongst young people and really amongst people of our age as well. Life is so comfortable for them that they don't feel that they need to depend on God. So they've lost that sense of urgency, and it becomes a kind of a take it or leave it. Whereas I still think in areas of higher deprivation, or perhaps areas of where there's been a lot of migration in the last sort of 10 to 15 years from these countries, where they face considerable persecution just for practicing their faith. It's so much more important to them. It's much more central to family life. It's part of their daily discussions. The kids are formed better, or even if they're not better formed, they know that they are dependent on God's grace for everything. And so in terms of the effort that you make with the young people, you're off to a good start already. So it's about formation. Whereas I think, in areas like where we live, for example, I think you're almost evangelizing rather than forming. It's like they have to catch on to God first, really, and understand why this is so important before you can start to even sort of form them in the faith. It's almost, you don't want them to lose the faith completely. So, I think it really does depend on the demographic, and that's been really interesting, kind of stepping into a different community demographic. Just actually really encouraging that there are still young people who really do believe and just need that kind of gentle guidance and formation.
Thank God. Do you not think, though, that even in more affluent areas, there still is a desperate need for God? And you see, you know, with film stars and football players, they're still desperately, so even though they've got all the money and all the wealth and everything, the big house and the big flash car, that you still see these people are desperately unhappy in lots of instances, aren't they? And looking for some meaning in their life. And sure,
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, the street evangelization I was involved with recently, it was one of the things that struck me. We were sort of doing a debrief afterwards and saying that you don't often stand in the high street and look at faces, do you? You know, you're not looking at those people's eyes. You normally get out the car, you've got the kids with you or whatever, and you know, you're rushing to complete whatever task you've got to do. So to see this sort of sea of people coming towards you and the look in their face, and just a look of just people going about their daily jobs, but you because you're paying attention, you can see, you know, it sounds really trite, but that you can see that need for Christ. You can see that need for the gospel, how desperate it is. And in lots of ways, I kind of can't help but feel that we're not preaching the gospel. You know, we're enclosed in our little communities, aren't we? And in our, you know, our beautiful churches, we're so privileged. You know, Christians are so privileged as well that we're not going out. We don't believe in the power, the transformative power of the gospel lots of the time. And it's not easy.
No,
it's not an easy
no,
thing
maybe
to
we
do.
write people off. Maybe we write people off too quickly, and it's either a case of you've got it or you haven't, and if you haven't got it, you're not going to get it, and that's not the gospel message. That's not what we're called to. That's not our mission, is it? No, you're right. We can become very inward looking rather than being outward looking, and maybe that's what the Pope is getting at in a roundabout way, is that we do have to be outward looking. You know, it's not just about kind of you know, locking the doors, bolting ourselves in, and protecting what's in our own little community. You know, we should be reaching out, and we should be meeting people where they are. But like John Wilson said, it's not about then leaving them there. It's actually about accompanying them somewhere. I agree.
Well, that's the key thing. That was the key observation for me involved with practical evangelization, is that they are desperate for you to take them somewhere. You know, all this rhetoric about meeting people where they are is meaningless if there isn't some transformative dynamic to what we're actually, if what we're trying to bring them doesn't have some value to change their lives and move them on from, you know, where they are locked in those chains of sin. So very interesting anyway, and I think it's very worthwhile for all of us to think about. Okay, shall we move on to the next bit?
Yeah.
What postulates were most frequently presented during the Roman session of the Synod? The Synod was to be dedicated to the issue of synodality, that is, seeking solutions on how to arrange the relationship between the various states of life within the Church, such as bishops, presbyters, religious women and men, and laity, so that it serves the work of evangelization the best way possible. As I mentioned, most of the lay people in Poland consider this a matter of utmost importance. They have also made it clear that they expect the Church to discover new ways to proclaim the gospel without compromising doctrine, remaining faithful to Christ and the gospel. Thanks be to God for that. On the opening day of the Synod, however, we all received by email the documents of the German Synodal Weg. Almost all of the demands listed there raise serious concerns for me. I believe the Church in Germany is in the greatest crisis since the Reformation. In turn, I read the mailing of the above documents as an attempt to disseminate the German problems across the Church. The documents draw profusely from Protestant theology and the language of modern politics. From there comes the conviction that the Church should conform to the world by adopting a democratic system and the standards of liberal bureaucracy. In Germany, we generally have a church with an expanded bureaucracy. From this comes the desire to limit the power of the bishops and the intention to build a secular power structure parallel to the hierarchical one, as well as to introduce a secular supervision of the bishops. Well, we know all about that, don't we?
Well, I mean, it's probably worth just noting that the setup of the church in Germany is like quite different to anywhere else, isn't it, really? And I don't know a huge amount about it other than the idea of the church tax, and that if you're not paying that, by the sounds of things, if you want your child baptized, it's not going to happen. And is there truth in that, or what do you know about that, the church in Germany?
Yeah, well, so basically you have to opt out of it, in order, and then you suffer the penalty of not having a funeral and stuff like that, as far as I can gather. So, but what we do know is that it makes the German church extremely rich, but empty. So there's not a lot of people go to mass, but the church has got lots of money, and so you've got this bizarre situation. And I often think about vocations. If you look at the recent Bishop of Speyer, the Bishop of Speyer, Weissman, who came out and said that with instructions for his priests to bless same-sex relationships, it's a desperately sad situation in that diocese. And I put something on my blog about it that gives you some of the statistics. It's like one of the worst dioceses, one of the two worst dioceses in Germany in terms of people who actually attend mass and who actually participate in the faith. And they've got no vocations or anything like that. It's all in free fall over there. And it's this incredible idea that, we have to do it harder. We have to do the destruction harder. That's the only answer. When they talk about the Holy Spirit, this is what really frustrates me, because, you think that they would be able to have a look at it and say, oh, hang on a minute, the Spirit's telling us something different here. But instead, they just want to synod harder. They just, pull away from the church even further. And all the evidence is that they're just on a path to complete destruction. But wide is the way that leads to perdition, Anna. Okay, let's do the next bit. I
did that on a piece of homework with my son this evening, actually.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. It's known from previous declarations that some bishops' conferences advocated the introduction of the practice of blessing homosexual couples, the abolition of priestly celibacy, or the ordination of women to the diaconate and even to the priesthood. What's your opinion on these issues? Well, I think we can probably guess, don't you? Christ is the saviour of all people, regardless of their origin, race, colour, sexual orientation, nationality, gender, etc. Therefore, the Church, which Pope Francis strongly emphasises, we must not close the door, the gate of mercy, to anyone who wishes to draw near to Christ. At the same time, the conditions for the truthfulness of this encounter with Christ are the same for everyone. Whatever our differences, including gender, sexual orientation, it is always conversion, turning away from sin and adopting a lifestyle in accordance with the gospel. A benediction in Latin means to call someone good. Benedictions or blessings of homosexual unions would mean that the Church approves of the lifestyle of homosexual partnerships, even if it does not equate them with marriages, which also means sex between same-sex couples, what has always been defined as a sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition, would now become something positive. The Catholic Church distinguishes between homosexual inclinations and homosexual acts. The former, although disordered, are not considered sinful. The latter are sinful, and in the words of the Catechism, will in no way be approved by the Church. The Church calls persons with homosexual inclinations to a life of chastity. While a person may not personally decide on their inclination, they are not denied the freedom that allows them to live in accordance with their own informed choice. The distinction between inclinations and acts stems both from the faith and tradition of the Church and from the observation that people experiencing gender dysphoria, despite the intrinsic diversity of this group, generally follow two distinctly different paths through life, adopting two different lifestyles, some often identifying with the designation LGBTQ+, lead lives that are clearly at odds with the Church's teaching, yet they often seek to change that teaching. Others who do not identify with the above name live a life of chastity and expect the Church to reinforce them in this choice through its teaching. People in this second group do not feel rejected by the Catholic sexual morality. On the contrary, through the Church's teaching, they have been able to understand themselves better and have experienced a profound encounter with Christ through the sacraments. It is painful for them that in pastoral practice they no longer encounter the Church's teaching more and more often. They often encounter a typification that corresponds to the language of the LGBTQ+ movement, but has nothing to do with the reality of their lives and even rejects it. These people, despite trying to live in a state of sanctifying grace and striving for holiness, feel abandoned by the church, which ignores their need for spiritual guidance and support. They seek the attack on the church's teachings that they follow in their lives as a direct assault on their own faith and their life choice of fidelity to Christ. They do not understand why the church is trying to marginalize them. Not only do they feel alone, but they are also psychologically and destabilized by a pastoral care practice that undermines the meaning of chastity and a person's capacity to live in chastity. For example, representatives of the American Courage Group were not invited to the Synod, nor were those whose testimonies are published by Marcus Hoffman in his book, Wellich es will. Representatives of other currents were included instead. And this is such a powerful bit, isn't it? Because it really does. I'm really surprised that he was able to go straight to that and really pull out probably the most important part of the whole inclusion and diversity discussion, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I just think it just paints a desperately sad picture, doesn't it? You know, people who are spending their life trying to live according to the teaching of the church and are receiving no encouragement at all. And that's not, you know, this doesn't just describe, I think, the experience of same-sex attracted Catholics. You know, it describes, you know, a whole number of people that I know personally in the church who are trying to live according to the church's, you know, teachings on human sexuality, whether that's within marriage and being open to life, and they just don't feel that they're getting any support at all, even though they're choosing a path that's really hard. You know, and if the Synod is meant to be, you know, welcoming to all and listening to everybody, why are we excluding these groups, and why are we not listening to their experiences, and why do we not value their experiences? It seems to support the idea that a particular narrative is being pushed, and I don't want to believe that it is, but equally, you know, when you weigh up the evidence, that's certainly what it appears to be, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of counter message that is suggesting anything otherwise. So I'm not sure what else we're supposed to conclude from what we're observing and from what these poor struggling people are experiencing.
Yeah, well, and again, the semiotics were very clear, weren't they? Where, you know, you've got the Pope having regular tea parties with Father James Martin and writing him private letters telling him how brilliant he is, and meeting with Sister Janine Gramick, who's the dissident head of New Ways Ministry, which is a group that was banned by the US Bishops' Conference. And now, all of a sudden, they're flavour of the month, and the Pope's meeting with them and having photo ops. So that, you know, the signalling is very clear, even if the language is ambiguous. And, you know, you have to sort of judge someone by their actions, I think, don't you? And that's the problem, is that it misses a whole. This is a lot of the problem I see with bishops in the UK as well, is that the discussion lacks nuance. And when you study theology, you are taught all sides of the argument, aren't you? And hopefully you learn why the church it's hard teaching, but the church calls it, we're all called to chastity, and chastity means the proper integration of our sexual inclination into our lives, which is, you know, a healthy, wholesome understanding of what it means to be a sexual being in your life. And that, you know, fundamentally, that means that recognizing the fact that our sexuality is ordered towards procreation. And it's really interesting to see some of these, like the latest wave of feminists. I don't know if you've been paying attention to people like Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, you know, who seem to have, aren't religious people, but they're through sort of a feminist direction, they've come to espouse Catholic, like it's like they're teaching straight out of the Catechism, you know, where they're saying that these things are extremely dangerous for us and that we need to be wary of it. So I just thought it was a beautiful exposition there from the Archbishop of church teaching.
He explains so well the position of the church on the matter, you know, really, really articulates that well. It couldn't be clearer.
Yeah, thank God. Okay, so we're where are we now? We're an hour in and we're about halfway through, so we better crack on.
Yeah, and I haven't read any more of the document than this, so I'm reading this for the first time now.
All right, so let's see if we can fly through a bit of it here. What do you think about the German synodal way? So, I mean, this is going to be more of the same stuff, isn't it? And the postulates of which have been included in the document Instrumentum Laboris. Germany is pushing hard to introduce the diaconate for women. This topic recurs 3 times in the synthesis report. However, they do not cite theological arguments, but the ban on gender discrimination and women's empowerment. This argumentation suggests that there is an issue here is not the diaconate, but rather the position of women in the church. Consequently, the introduction of women's diaconate would not be a solution to the issue, but would only inflame the dispute over the ordination of women to the priesthood. Historically, the diaconate of women differed from the diaconate of men. Women were deaconesses because of the women's baptism. I mean, this has all been played out, hasn't it? I don't know why they're bringing it up again, but it just seems like a lack of formation and a lack of understanding, really. And the Pope has been clear. He's sort of, well, again, he's been clear, but we're still having the discussion, aren't we? So it makes you think, is there something else going on? We've got to look at it again, apparently, haven't we? So, okay, then he goes on about celibacy. The report says the different assessments have been expressed on this subject. We must be aware that those who speak to the voluntariness of celibacy are, in fact, advocating its abolition. Celibacy is one of the most significant signs that one truly believes in the realness and truth of God. It's the genuine treasure of our church. Perhaps this is why the ancient Christian writers called celibacy the white martyrdom. Celibacy, like martyrdom, is an emphatic sign of faith in the absolute primacy of God in life. The life of a celibate is a clear sign that God is the precious pearl, the only one with whom it is possible to live. The real and ultimate disability in life is not celibacy, but godlessness. Life without God, atheism. God is all we need. The radicalism of giving up the most beautiful form of human love, marriage and family, is the sign that God is absolutely necessary for all of us to fulfill human destiny. Who is to show the truth if not the pastors in the community? The fact that some priests have been a scandal in recent years makes it more difficult for some people to understand the greatness and meaning of a celibate life. However, it is not sufficient reason for the church to abandon priestly celibacy. Still, young people across the globe are making this commitment generously. Thousands of priests see Christ himself, the high priest, who did not start a family, as a model for service to others. Although inclusion was often repeated in the synodal hall, few people are wondering what it means. Meanwhile, before it reached the synod hall, the term was clearly defined in the language of our secular politics. We should not associate it with all-inclusive holidays, but also the International Planned Parenthood Federation and the UN Women's Agenda. The documents of these institutions are unequivocal in their undermining the binary division of sex and recognizing all forms of gender expression as equivalent. They are also about abolishing or loosening the existing criteria for accession to various groups, including the church. When the Lutheran Church was a state church in Sweden, an atheist demanded admission to the church community without baptism. He won the court case, which ruled that requiring baptism was discrimination. The question arises, was the Lord Jesus' teaching inclusive or exclusionary? Jesus left a clear message to the disciples: go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. He did good and died on the cross for everyone, including the greatest sinners, but was crucified, among other things, because he made things clear. He told the truth. Also, the uncomfortable one for the listeners: you belong to your father, the devil. These were not random words. Radical inclusion was not his highest priority, as seen when many disciples left after his speech about the bread of life in John 6. Believers in Christ do not send anyone to hell. They pray for everyone's salvation, which does not mean they downplay human attitudes, choices, and actions. That is why St. Paul commands the Christians in Corinth to exclude the incestuous person from the community by stating, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. He then adds that they ought not even eat with such a person. Certainly the gospel of Jesus was offered to everyone, men, women, Jews, pagans. However, the invitation of the Lord Jesus did not mean that everyone is welcome on their own terms. It comprised the call to conversion and penance. The word inclusivity definitely does not fit into Christian theology. It comes to us from social sciences. It is where the problem arises. The Church professes the dogma of infallibility of the Pope. At the same time, one can get the impression that some theologians and bishops believe in the infallibility of social sciences, and not even the sciences, but some mainstream sociologists and theories in which few decades will not be mentioned in history textbooks. Now, that seems to be a direct dig at Cardinal Hollerich, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, I was just reading it thinking the Poles are so blessed. Like, they've got an archbishop that is just speaking the truth and speaking it without fear. And how refreshing to hear a voice in the church like this.
Yeah, thanks be to God. Yeah, it is a good thing. And, you know, I think just coming off the back of Cardinal Hollerich before the Synod saying that the church teaching was wrong on this issue, you know, it's really good to see Gądecki coming out so clearly and calling out the anthropology, the shallow secular anthropology of the Synod for what it is. And he's also, while at the same time framing the Christological anthropology of the Second Vatican Council, so that we can clearly see the contrast and you know, hopefully discern what is actually going on in the church. Okay, he continues. It seems to me that the sentences such as the anthropological categories we have developed are not sufficient to grasp the complexity of the elements arising from experience or scientific knowledge, stem either from an unconscious inferiority complex or a superstitious approach to science. This sentence contradicts the conviction expressed, for example, in Redemptor Hominis, number 10. The man who wishes to understand himself through and not just in accordance with immediate, partial, often superficial and even illusory standards and measures of his being, he must be with his unrest, uncertainly, and even his weakness and sinfulness with his life and death, draw near to Christ. He must, so to speak, enter into him with all his own self. He must appropriate and assimilate the whole reality of the incarnation and redemption in order to find himself. If this profound process takes place within him, he then bears fruit not only of adoration of God, but also the deep wonder at himself. It's beautiful words.
It really is beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah. It seems that dubia were primarily a reaction to the postulates of the synodal way, which had been criticized by the Vatican several times previously. I think their fundamental meaning boils down to the doubts about how changes in church teaching are introduced. On the one hand, we have declarations that nothing changes, so the importance of the teachings of previous popes is not questioned. On the other hand, we have some understatements on the part of Pope Francis, which are sometimes interpreted differently by different theologians and bishops. Thus, it is said that the Pope wants something, although nowhere it is actually articulated clearly. So again, this is a reference to the ambiguity, isn't it? And the, you know, the confusion. 10 years of which we've had to suffer, which is very important.
It's a big problem. Sorry, I was just going to say, you know, just in terms of unity, like if I'm just thinking about the, you know, you bring this whole diverse group of people together for a synod, and you would expect that, you know, that within that universal church there is some underlying thing that unifies us. And the Archbishop seems to be pointing out what it is that should unify us, and yet there is such divergence. And if the Pope is not that point of unity, you know, if he's not speaking with clarity and things are being interpreted differently, you know, no wonder there's so much disagreement, you know, among the faithful about how we move forward.
Yeah, totally. And I can only see it as being a continuing sort of divisiveness. That's, you know, all it's ever going to be. I remember Bishop Barron explained, I think I've got the video on my blog, about what the Pope is for, sort of, you know, in talking to non-Catholics, really. And he's saying the Pope's a bit like an umpire, you know. You have to have an umpire who's able to say, yeah, that is how to play the game, and that is not how to play the game. But unfortunately, Francis, you know, sort of says one thing and does another thing, and it ends up, you know, he's sort of encouraging dialogue on one side of things and shutting down, kicking out bishops who disagree with him on another side of things. It's very, you know, very, very bad, dark times, I think, in terms of the papacy. And I worry that he's damaging the actual office of the Pope, because I don't think there's been a pope like this before who sort of undermined previous popes' teachings. And, you know, this is what he's put in, he says in here, isn't it? So the importance of the teachings of previous popes is not questioned. But really, you've got that Christological anthropology that was the legacy of Pope John Paul II, and then Pope Benedict built on that. And Pope Francis seems to be directly trying to undermine that. Okay. On the other hand, we have some understatements on the part of Pope Francis. Right, I've done that bit, haven't I? Justifying the light of tradition. In turn, this leads to a situation you mentioned, that same-sex unions are blessed in Belgium, although the Pope never actually officially allowed it. The faithful need clarity in matters of faith and morality. The point is for the Pope to express his position clearly, not by winking to those at the left or right. Brilliantly said. And that's exactly the problem. You've got something that's completely not allowed in Poland, and it's going on in Belgium, and that is not a healthy position for the church, and it's bad leadership, frankly. You know, why is it worth dealing with the Synodal Weg documents? In one of these statements, Bishop Georg Batzing, he's awful, isn't he, said that he managed to include all German postulates in the draft final document of the Synod. So there is a risk that the Synod Fathers, by voting on the final document next year, will in fact approve the demand of the Synodal Weg, albeit with slightly different wording. It becomes justified to ask about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Synodal Church, thus understood. Is there continuity or breakup involved in this reform proposal? The Synod at this stage has not adopted any document summarising the deliberations, but this will happen next year. After a longer and deeper reflection in a fully formed manner, the task of the Synod was to rekindle the charm of evangelization, charism of evangelization among both the laity and the clergy. The appreciation of the laity and the church is critical, but it cannot lead to the destruction of the hierarchical and apostolic structure of the church. St. John Henry Newman, who was grateful that despite many turbulent events in the light of faith reached his generation untainted, states that sometimes in history the torch of orthodox faith was carried by only one man, as everyone else had gone astray, including the bishops. In this image, I think, effectively portrays our trust in the Holy Spirit, who will not allow the light kindled by Christ to be extinguished or replaced by some other light. The end. What do you think of that then?
Yeah, I think it's great that he finishes with Newman, just because this whole idea of Newman's development of doctrine has kind of been put forward by those who would see the church kind of developing and changing its approach to a lot of the issues that he speaks about in the interview. You know, and actually when you read Newman, that's not what he's saying at all.
Oh, Newman would have a fit, exactly, yeah. And he's very clear. That's what the most frustrating thing to me is, when they pick these bits of theology, and it's like, you know, what's fascinating is that we saw it in the last synod in the Church of England, didn't we? I don't know if you, the former Bishop of Chelmsford, now the Archbishop of York, like brought up Newman and sort of as to try and, you know, they're further ahead than we are, but he was, you know, gave this false interpretation of Newman to try and say that, well, you know, things change, got to keep up with the times. That's not what Newman's saying at all. So absolutely extraordinary. Well, I think it's a really, really good intervention there from Gądecki, don't you? And
it's given me great hope, actually, that those voices are still out there, and you know, the fact that this has come out and John Wilson's stuff has come out in the same week, you know, and what otherwise could have been quite a depressing week in terms of what's happened in America, and you know, with everything else that's going on in the news at the moment, and then everything that's coming out of Rome, you know, you can begin to feel quite sort of discouraged, and we shouldn't feel discouraged, because, you know, it's always in these scenarios in the past. He's obviously making a reference at the end there to Newman referencing Saint Athanasius, you know, in the Arian crisis, you know, and it's at these times of crisis where the Orthodox voice emerges, that, you know, the true voice of the Holy Spirit emerges. And so we have to be hopeful, you know, we have to put our hope in and our trust in that, and not be discouraged, even though it's difficult. And so, you know, anytime we hear voices like this good and holy Archbishop from Poland, we should feel encouraged. We shouldn't feel alone, you know, and we should keep persevering with what we know to be the truth that's been revealed to us.
Definitely. Well, and I think the important thing to remember is that doesn't change. And, you know, we're living in a tiny little window of church history, aren't we? And, you know, when you look at the different papacies throughout the ages, they're just tiny little slots of time. But of course, from a subjective point of view, it seems incredibly turbulent. I remember when we were doing church history, we were taught that we're living in the shadow of a great council. And if you look at the history of all the great councils, there's always a sort of period of to and fro before things settle down again. And we're just one sort of lifetime. I think, you know, I'd encourage anyone listening to remember that we focus on Christ. That's what the church is all about, that Christ is our leader, and the faith doesn't, you know, it doesn't change. It is, we can rely on it. And this is one generation that is sort of moving through the church. Really, they've not got a lot of time left. And everything we hear is that and I know you'd agree with me, is that all the guys coming through seminary now are extremely orthodox. And, you know, that's all really, really encouraging. And even, you know, now I know all over the world, some amazing priests, you know, and this is what this is all about, really. This is about us coming together as Catholics to encourage each other and to say that we believe in the faith as deposited by the apostles, and, you know, we're holding to that faith, and we can support each other in that, and we can do that through conversations, through discussing the difficult challenges, perhaps sharing good news like this, and praying for each other, of course, as well.
So important.
Okay, on that note, shall we call it a day? That's
yeah, okay.
A fire for you there, Anna, but please God, I haven't scared you off, and you'll come back and
yeah, that would be good. Thank you for having me.
All right, shall we just finish with a glory be?
Yeah, let's do that.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll see you again soon for something else.